The wind howled across the frozen wasteland, carrying flakes of ice that bit into Darren's skin like tiny knives. He pulled his thick jacket tighter around his body, but it was useless. The cold had already settled deep into his bones. His small fire flickered weakly, barely holding against the storm. He knew it wouldn't last much longer. Darren had been stranded on this planet for 3 days. His ship had crashed after a navigation failure, and his distress beacon was damaged. He had tried fixing it, but the freezing temperatures made even the simplest tasks feel impossible. His fingers were numb, his supplies were running low, and worst of all, he was alone. He exhaled, watching his breath turn to mist. Would anyone find him before the cold took him? Then, through the swirling snow, he heard something. A heavy crunch. Then another. Darren's heart pounded. He reached for the small plasma cutter at his belt. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. The noise grew louder. Someone, or something, was approaching. Then, from the darkness, a massive shape emerged. Darren's first instinct was to run, but his legs refused to move. The figure was enormous, at least 12 feet tall, with broad shoulders and thick, armor-like skin. Its deep-set eyes glowed faintly in the dim firelight, and frost clung to its body like a second layer of armor. It was an alien. Darren had seen many species during his travels, but nothing like this. The creature took another slow step forward, then stopped just outside the fire's reach. It stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for something. Then, in a deep, strained voice, it spoke. "Can I share your fire, human? I can't survive alone." Darren's grip on the plasma cutter tightened. The alien's voice was heavy, rough, like someone who had not spoken in a long time. It knew his language. For a moment, neither of them moved. Darren's mind raced. The alien was clearly suffering. The frost on its body looked unnatural, as if it had been out in the storm for too long. But was it a trick? A trap? Could he really trust something so big, so different? The alien shifted slightly, and Darren noticed its hands were shaking. Not from anger. From cold. It was freezing. Just like him. Darren hesitated, then slowly moved aside, making room by the fire. "Sit," he said cautiously. The alien let out a breath, a heavy sound, like relief. Carefully, it stepped closer and lowered itself to the ground. Sitting cross-legged. Even sitting, it was massive, its head nearly level with Darren's. The firelight revealed more details now. The alien's thick, grayish skin was cracked in places, and its chest rose and fell in slow, labored breaths. It was built for strength, but right now, it looked exhausted. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Only the wind howled around them, the fire crackling softly between them. Finally, Darren broke the silence. "You speak my language," he said. The alien nodded. "Studied. Listened. Long ago." It paused, as if choosing its words carefully. "You are human." Darren raised an eyebrow. "And you?" The alien straightened slightly, placing one large hand against its chest. "I am Rune, of the Yelfar." Darren had never heard of them before. "You got a ship." Rune's eyes darkened. "Destroyed." Darren exhaled sharply. "So you're stuck here too?" Rune nodded once. "Yes." He looked at the fire, watching the flames dance. "Your fire is small, but strong." Darren almost laughed. "Yeah, well, it's all I've got." Rune lifted one massive hand and slowly extended it toward the fire. His thick fingers trembled as he absorbed the warmth. Darren watched him carefully. Rune didn't seem dangerous. If anything, he looked just as lost as Darren felt. "You been out here long?" Darren asked. Rune's gaze shifted to the storm beyond. "2 cycles of your sun." Darren frowned. 2 days. "Yes." Darren shook his head. "And you survived out there?" "Yelfar are strong," Rune rumbled. "But not against this cold. I cannot survive alone." Darren looked at his small fire, then at the towering alien beside him. Maybe neither of them could. After a moment he sighed. Well, I guess we're both out of luck. Ruin turned his glowing eyes toward Darren. Perhaps not. Together, we may survive. Darren wasn't sure how much he trusted the alien yet, but one thing was clear. Sticking together was better than freezing alone. He reached into his pack, pulled out a ration bar, and broke it in half. He tossed one piece to Ruin. Here. It's not much, but it's food. Ruin caught it, studying it curiously. Then, with surprising gentleness, he nodded his thanks before eating. The storm raged on, but for the first time in days, Darren didn't feel completely alone. Darren watched as Ruin lifted the eel-like creature onto his shoulder. It was huge, at least 5 feet long. Can we eat it? Darren asked. Yes, Ruin said. Fire will cook it. Flesh will keep us strong. Darren shook his head in amazement. You're full of surprises, you know that. Ruin didn't reply, simply turning back toward the fire. Darren followed, his mind racing. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance after all. A fire that burns brighter. Back at the fire, Darren used his knife to cut pieces of the creature, while Ruin watched curiously. They cooked the meat over the flames, the scent filling the air. Darren took a cautious bite. It was tough but edible. He nodded. Not bad. Ruin took a bite as well. His eyes closed for a moment, and then he nodded in approval. The fire crackled between them, brighter than before. They were still stranded. The cold was still deadly, but they were not alone anymore. And for now, that was enough. The fire burned steadily, casting a warm glow against the cold, endless night. Darren and Ruin sat close to the flames, eating in silence. The cooked meat from the eel-like creature was tough and slightly bitter, but it was food. It gave them strength. Darren chewed slowly, watching Ruin. The massive alien sat still, his glowing eyes focused on the fire, deep in thought. His large hands rested on his knees, but Darren could see the exhaustion in his posture. The cold had weakened him, even more than he let on. Darren swallowed his last bite and sighed. We can't just sit here forever, he said. The fire's good, but we need more than just one meal. We need a real plan. Ruin nodded slightly. You speak truth, human. Fire is life, but it will not carry us far. Darren glanced at the sky. It was still covered in thick, swirling clouds. There was no sign of sunlight, no break in the endless storm. How long do you think this storm will last? Darren asked. Ruin was silent for a moment. Then he looked toward the horizon. Too long. Darren sighed again. Great. He rubbed his hands together, trying to think. All right. First, we need more fuel for the fire. We can't let it go out. Ruin nodded. Agreed. Darren looked at the small pile of burning logs. They had already used most of what was nearby. You saw any more wood around here? Ruin shook his head. No trees. Only ice and rock. Darren frowned. Then what do we burn? Ruin was quiet again. Then, slowly, he said, There is something. Darren raised an eyebrow. What? Ruin stood up, his massive frame towering over the fire. He pointed toward the frozen river where they had caught the eel-like creature. Beneath the ice, there is more than just food. Darren's frown deepened. What do you mean? Ruin turned his glowing eyes toward him. Come, I will show you. Beneath the ice. Darren hesitated for a moment, then grabbed his gear and followed. The cold wind bit at his face as they left the warmth of the fire behind. The frozen river stretched out before them, smooth and untouched except for the place where Ruin had shattered the ice earlier. Darren could still see the dark water beneath, shifting slightly in the dim light. Ruin knelt by the hole and placed one large hand against the ice. His fingers pressed against it, as if feeling for something unseen. Then he closed his eyes. For a moment, there was silence. Only the wind howled around them. Then, a deep, rumbling sound. Darren's heart pounded. What was that? Ruin opened his eyes. There. He pointed at the ice a few feet away. Break it. Darren narrowed his eyes. Break it? With what? I don't have fists like yours, big guy. Ruin looked at him for a moment, then reached out and picked up a heavy stone. He handed it to Darren. Darren sighed. Great. Manual labor. Just what I needed. He took the stone and smashed it against the ice. The first hit barely made a dent. The second cracked the surface slightly. Ruin watched. Again. Darren gritted his teeth and swung harder. This time, the ice splintered, revealing something beneath. Not water. Something dark, something solid. Darren blinked. What is that? Ruin reached into the hole and pulled up a chunk of frozen, black material. He held it up to the dim light. Frozen fuel, Ruin said. Darren stared. Fuel. Like stuff that burns. Ruin nodded. Yes, my people call it deep fire stone. It burns hotter and longer than wood. Darren's eyes widened. And there's more of this under the ice. Much more. Darren let out a short laugh. Well, why didn't you say so earlier? Let's get digging. A fire that will last. It took time, but together they broke through the ice, pulling up more and more of the strange frozen fuel. Darren's hands ached from the cold, but the thought of a stronger fire kept him going. When they finally returned to camp, their arms were full of deep fire stone. Darren dropped a few pieces near the fire and stepped back. All right, let's see if this stuff really works. Ruin picked up one of the stones and placed it gently into the flames. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the fire roared to life. The flames grew taller and brighter, burning a deep, rich orange. Heat surged outward, instantly warming the air around them. The difference was incredible. Darren stepped back, eyes wide. Whoa, that's amazing. Ruin nodded, his eyes reflecting the flames. Now, the fire will not die so easily. Darren let out a breath and smiled. We might actually make it through this. The hunter and the survivor. With the fire burning hotter than before, the cold no longer felt so deadly. But there was still one problem. Food. Darren sat down, stretching his arms. All right. Fire problem solved. Now how do we make sure we don't starve? Ruin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, There is more food. I can find it. Darren looked at him. You sure? Ruin nodded. I know where it hides. Darren hesitated. You're not in great shape, big guy. You should rest first. Ruin shook his head. The storm will get worse. We must act now. Darren sighed. All right, but I'm coming with you. Ruin turned toward him, studying him carefully. Then he gave a small nod. Then we hunt together, human. Darren grinned. Sounds like a plan. The fire burned strong behind them as they stepped into the frozen wild, ready to face whatever came next. For the first time since the crash, Darren didn't feel like he was fighting alone. And maybe, just maybe, they really would survive. The storm had not yet passed. The wind howled across the icy plains, carrying fine snow that stung against exposed skin. Darren and Ruin walked side by side, their bodies hunched against the cold as they moved away from the safety of their fire. Darren pulled his jacket tighter. Tell me again why we're out here instead of sitting next to that nice, warm fire. Ruin's deep voice rumbled through the wind. Because fire does not fill the stomach. Darren sighed. Yeah, I know. Still, I'd rather not freeze solid before we even find anything. Ruin's glowing eyes swept across the landscape. There is food in these lands, but it hides. It does not want to be found. Darren frowned. What exactly are we looking for? Ruin pointed toward the distance. The ice plains hold many creatures. Some live under the snow, some in the caves beyond the cliffs. They are strong and fast. We must be careful. Darren's stomach tightened. He wasn't a hunter. He was a pilot, a scout, not someone who tracked wild beasts in a frozen wasteland. He had a small plasma cutter, but it was made for cutting through metal, not hunting creatures. You ever hunted one of these things before? Darren asked. Ruan nodded. On my world, I hunted beasts far larger. This will be no different. Darren glanced at the alien's massive arms and decided to believe him. Tracks in the snow. They walked for nearly an hour before Ruan suddenly stopped. Darren took another step before realizing the alien was no longer beside him. He turned back. What is it? Ruan knelt, running his massive hand over the snow. Tracks. Darren stepped closer and saw them. Large, deep imprints in the snow, shaped like clawed feet. They were spread out, as if whatever made them had been moving quickly. Darren crouched beside him. How fresh. Ruan sniffed the air. Not old. It passed here not long ago. Darren exhaled. Great. And what exactly are we tracking? Ruan's eyes darkened. A shadow maw. Darren's stomach dropped. That doesn't sound friendly. It is not. Darren rubbed his temples. Let me guess. Vague, fast, and deadly. Ruan nodded. Yes, but it is also food. Darren sighed. Of course it is. A dangerous plan. They followed the tracks for nearly another hour, moving cautiously. The storm made it difficult to see far, but Ruan led the way with confidence. Darren's fingers were numb from the cold, and his legs ached from trudging through deep snow. Just as he was about to suggest turning back, Ruan suddenly raised a hand. Darren froze. What is it? Ruan crouched low. It is close. Darren followed his gaze and saw it, a dark shape moving through the snow, nearly blending into the storm. The creature was huge, at least 10 feet long, with thick fur and 6 legs that moved silently across the ice. Its head was low, sniffing the air. Sharp, curved claws cut through the snow with each step. Darren swallowed hard. That's big. Ruan's voice was calm. Big means much food. Darren resisted the urge to groan. All right, great. But how do we kill it? Ruan's muscles tensed. You will distract. I will strike. Darren's eyes widened. Hold on. Distract. Me? What does that mean? Ruan's glowing eyes locked onto his. It means run. Darren threw up his hands. Oh, fantastic. So I just run around while that thing chases me. And you do what? Punch it. Ruan flexed his massive fingers. If needed. Darren let out a shaky breath. All right. Fine. But if I die, I'm haunting you. Ruan simply nodded. The hunt begins. Darren took a deep breath, steeling himself. Okay, here goes nothing. Before he could change his mind, he picked up a rock and hurled it at the creature. The rock struck the shadow maw's thick hide with a dull thud. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the beast's head snapped toward Darren. Its eyes glowed faintly in the storm, and with a low guttural growl, it charged. Darren's heart exploded with panic. Oh crap. He turned and ran. The beast was fast, its 6 powerful legs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. Darren sprinted as hard as he could, feeling the ground tremble beneath him. The wind roared in his ears. His lungs burned. The shadow maw was gaining. Any time now. Ruan, Darren gasped. Then, a massive figure leaped from the snow. Ruan slammed into the beast's side with bone-shaking force. The shadow maw let out a snarl as it was knocked off balance, its massive claws scraping across the ice. Before it could recover, Ruan wrapped his powerful arms around the creature's thick neck, straining to hold it in place. Strike, human. Ruan roared. Darren fumbled for his plasma cutter, igniting the tool. It wasn't a weapon, but right now it was all he had. He sprinted forward and plunged the plasma blade into the creature's exposed side. The shadow maw let out a piercing screech, thrashing violently. Ruan tightened his grip, muscles straining. Again. Darren stabbed again, forcing the plasma deeper into the beast's side. With one final shuddering growl, the shadow maw collapsed. For a long moment, Darren just stood there, panting. The wind howled around them, but the fight was over. Rune slowly released his grip and stepped back. His breath was heavy, but his eyes burned with satisfaction. Darren swallowed hard. Remind me never to do that again. Rune let out a low, rumbling chuckle. You fought well, human. Darren wiped sweat from his forehead, despite the cold. Yeah, well, let's just get this thing back to camp before another one shows up. Rune nodded. Agreed. Together, they began dragging the massive creature back toward the fire. The storm still raged. The cold still threatened. But tonight, they would not go hungry. And in this frozen wasteland, that was a victory worth celebrating. The storm howled as Darren and Rune dragged the massive shadow maw across the icy ground. The cold bit deep, but neither of them stopped. Their fire was still far away, but the thought of food and warmth pushed them forward. Darren's muscles burned. The beast was heavier than he had expected. He gritted his teeth and adjusted his grip. I swear, next time we hunt, we find something smaller, he muttered. Rune chuckled, his deep voice rumbling in the wind. A small meal will not last long. This will feed us for days. Darren groaned. Yeah, but only if we don't collapse trying to carry it back. Rune nodded, then grabbed more of the beast's thick fur and heaved it onto his back. The massive alien lifted most of the weight, letting Darren catch his breath. Darren shook his head in amazement. You're way too strong. Rune grunted. My kind must be strong. On my world, only the strongest survive the cold. Darren exhaled and tightened his grip. Well, let's survive this place first. With slow, steady steps, they continued their journey back to camp. The fire burns bright. By the time they reached the fire, Darren was shaking from exhaustion. He collapsed onto the snow, breathing hard. Rune dropped the shadow maw's body onto the ground and stretched his arms. You fought well, human, and you did not die. Darren chuckled weakly. Yeah, well, barely. The deep firestone still burned brightly, casting a warm glow. Darren held his hands over the flames, sighing as heat returned to his frozen fingers. All right, he said, standing up. How do we prepare this thing? Rune crouched beside the beast and pulled out a curved blade from his belt. I will cut. You will watch and learn. Darren smirked. Sounds fair. Rune worked with practiced skill, slicing through the thick fur and revealing the dark, rich meat beneath. The scent that rose wasn't unpleasant, though it was strange. Darren wrinkled his nose. Smells different. Rune nodded. It is strong, but good for the body. It will give you strength. Darren shrugged. As long as it's not poisonous. Rune's glowing eyes met his. I would not feed you poison, human. Darren raised his hands. Just making sure. Rune chuckled again and continued his work. Soon, thick chunks of meat were cut and placed over the fire. The flames sizzled as the fat dripped, filling the air with a rich, heavy scent. Darren's stomach growled loudly. Okay, I take it back. That smells amazing. Rune nodded. We feast soon. A meal worth fighting for. The first bite was heavenly. Darren hadn't expected much, but the meat was surprisingly tender and rich. It had a slightly smoky flavor from the fire, and the heat spread through his body, chasing away the last of the cold. He let out a satisfied groan. Oh man, this is good. Rune took a large bite and chewed slowly. Yes, good food makes strong warriors. Darren grinned. Well, I don't know about being a warrior, but I do know this is the best meal I've had in, well, since crashing here. Rune nodded. Eat well. We will need strength. Darren frowned. For what? Rune looked toward the dark horizon. The storm is growing worse. I fear this land holds more dangers than just hunger. Darren swallowed another bite, suddenly feeling uneasy. You think something else is out there. Ruhn's eyes glowed faintly in the firelight. I know it. Darren exhaled. Great, just when I was starting to feel safe. Ruhn tore off another piece of meat. Safety is an illusion. We must always be ready. Darren didn't like the sound of that, but he knew Ruhn was right. This planet was not kind. Shadows in the storm. After they had eaten, Darren sat near the fire, staring into the darkness beyond the light. The wind howled, carrying strange sounds through the night. He turned to Ruhn. What kind of dangers are we talking about? More shadow moss. Ruhn shook his head. No, there is something worse. Darren frowned. Define worse. Ruhn's voice was low. There are things that watch from the ice. I have seen them before. They do not hunt for food. They hunt for the sake of hunting. A chill ran down Darren's spine. You mean, they kill for sport? Ruhn nodded. Yes. Darren shuddered. Okay, that's horrifying. And you're just mentioning this now. Ruhn looked at him. There was no need to speak of ghosts when we were already starving. Darren groaned. Fantastic. And here I thought shadow maws were our biggest problem. Ruhn stared into the distance. No, the shadow maws are only beasts. But these other creatures, they are something else. Darren gripped his plasma cutter tightly. Well, that's just great. Do we have a plan if they show up? Ruhn's glowing eyes met his. Yes, we do not let the fire die. Darren blinked. That's it. Fire. Ruhn nodded. They fear it. Darren sighed in relief. Well, that's good news at least. Ruhn's expression didn't change. But fire will only keep them away for so long. Eventually, they will test us. Darren stared into the flames. Then I guess we'd better be ready. Ruhn nodded. Yes, and we will be. They sat in silence, listening to the storm. Beyond the fire's glow, something moved in the dark. Something watching. Something waiting. Darren tightened his grip on his plasma cutter. The battle for survival wasn't over yet. The night stretched long and cold. The fire flickered, its orange glow barely holding back the creeping darkness. Darren sat close to the flames, his plasma cutter resting in his lap, his ears straining against the howling wind. Ruhn sat across from him, silent and still, his glowing eyes fixed on the black horizon. His massive hands rested on his knees, but his body was tense. Ready. Darren took a deep breath. All right, let's talk about what's out there. These things you saw, what do they look like? Ruhn didn't blink. I do not know their true shape. They move in the storm, hiding in the wind. Sometimes I see shadows. Sometimes I hear whispers. Darren shivered. Whispers. That's not terrifying at all. Ruhn nodded. They are hunters, but not like the shadow maw. They do not chase. They do not rush. They wait. Darren clenched his fists. For what? Ruhn's deep voice was calm but heavy. For weakness. For the fire to die. Darren swallowed. He glanced at the deep firestone, its steady flames licking at the frozen air. So as long as we keep the fire burning, we're safe. Ruhn's glowing eyes narrowed slightly. Safe, for now. Darren ran a hand through his hair. Great. No pressure. Then, the wind shrieked, carrying a sound through the night. A distant, hollow cry. Darren's stomach tightened. That was just the wind, right? Ruhn didn't answer. Darren's pulse quickened. Right. Ruhn's eyes stayed on the darkness. No. Darren exhaled. Fantastic. The first test. Hours passed. The fire burned strong, but the storm raged harder, snow swirling in thick waves around them. Darren stood and grabbed a handful of dry wood, tossing it into the fire. The flames rose higher for a moment, but then the wind pushed against them, as if trying to smother the light. Ruhn finally moved, his massive form shifting slightly. They are close. Darren tensed. How do you know? Rune tilted his head slightly, listening. I can feel them. Darren scanned the darkness, gripping his plasma cutter. I don't see anything. Rune's deep voice was steady. You will. A flicker of movement, just beyond the fire's glow. Darren's heart slammed against his ribs. There. Rune didn't look. Do not chase it. That is what they want. Darren forced himself to stay put, but his instincts screamed at him to move. They want us to leave the fire. Rune nodded. Yes. They wait for foolishness. Darren gritted his teeth. Well, they picked the wrong guy, because I'm not that dumb. The shadows circled, shapes shifting in the storm. Then, a whisper. It was faint, almost like the wind, but it was not the wind. Darren's breath hitched. Did you hear that? Rune nodded. They are testing us. Darren's fingers twitched over his plasma cutter. Testing for what? For fear. Darren licked his lips. Well, that's just great, because I am definitely failing that test. Rune's expression didn't change. Hold your ground. Darren swallowed hard. He didn't move. The whispers grew louder. Shapes twisted at the edge of the firelight, never fully forming. They had no clear bodies, no eyes, no faces, just shadows moving in the storm. Darren gritted his teeth. If they're waiting for us to run, they're gonna be disappointed. Rune nodded approvingly. Good. The shadows shifted again. The whispers faded. Then silence. Darren barely breathed. Did we win? Rune stared into the darkness. Not yet. A trick of fire and fear. The fire crackled, casting flickering light across the snow. The storm raged on, but the whispers had stopped. Darren's muscles ached from staying tense for so long. His mind felt tired, but he forced himself to stay alert. How long do we have to do this? He muttered. Rune's voice was steady. Until they leave. Darren exhaled. And when will that be? Rune's glowing eyes met his. When they know they cannot break us. Darren ran a hand down his face. Well, I'd love to tell them that right now so I can get some sleep. Rune's expression remained serious. If we sleep, we die. Darren stiffened. All right. No sleeping. Got it. Rune picked up another piece of dry wood and placed it into the fire. The fire is life. It is our weapon. But there is another way to fight them. Darren raised an eyebrow. Oh, and what's that? Rune took a slow breath. We must show them that we do not fear the dark. Darren frowned. How do we do that? Rune stood up slowly, his massive form casting a long shadow over the snow. We stepped toward them. Darren's stomach twisted. Rune. That sounds like the opposite of a good idea. Rune didn't move his glowing gaze from the storm. If we do not run, if we do not cower, they will know we are not prey. Darren hesitated. His legs wanted to stay near the fire. His heart told him not to move. But deep inside, he knew Rune was right. Slowly, hesitantly, Darren stood. His body was stiff with fear, but he took one step forward, away from the firelight. The shadows shifted. The wind whispered. But Darren did not run. Rune stepped beside him. Hold the fire within you, human. Darren took another step. The shadows twitched, but did not strike. Darren clenched his fists. I'm not afraid of you, he whispered. The storm screamed, but the whispers vanished. The darkness seemed to pull back, inch by inch. Rune placed a heavy hand on Darren's shoulder. They are leaving. Darren let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Good, because I was 2 seconds away from screaming. Rune chuckled. Then it is good you did not. The fire burned brighter. The night felt less heavy. And for the first time, Darren believed they might actually survive. The night stretched on, but the whispers had faded. The storm still howled, but the dark shapes lurking in the snow no longer crept closer. Darren exhaled shakily, his breath misting in the frigid air. His legs felt like ice, but he refused to move. Ruin stood beside him, a silent guardian against the night. "Did we do it?" Darren murmured. Ruin did not answer at first. His glowing eyes stayed locked on the darkness beyond the fire's glow. Then, slowly, he nodded. "They are gone. For now." Darren let out a long breath. "Well, that was the worst night of my life." Ruin chuckled softly. "You did not run. That is why we are still standing." Darren smirked. "I thought my legs were just frozen stiff." Ruin placed a massive hand on Darren's shoulder, his grip firm but warm. "You were strong, human." Darren blinked, then shrugged. "I just did what I had to do." Ruin nodded. "That is what strength is." The fire crackled, sending warm embers into the cold air. The night was still dark, but Darren could feel it. Morning was near. The first light. As time passed, the sky shifted from deep black to soft gray. The storm was finally weakening. Darren shivered. His body was exhausted, but his mind was sharp. He knew they couldn't relax yet. "We should check the area," he said, glancing at Ruin. The tall alien nodded. "Yes. The land remembers who walks upon it. We must see if they left any signs." Darren grabbed his plasma cutter, even though he wasn't sure if it would help against creatures made of shadows. He followed Ruin as they stepped carefully beyond the fire's reach. The wind had smoothed out the snow, but here and there, faint marks remained, long, thin lines, almost like claws dragging across ice. Darren crouched down, running his hand over one. "They were right here." Ruin nodded. "Yes, but they did not enter the fire's light." Darren let out a breath. "So the fire really is the key." Ruin's glowing eyes watched the horizon. "It is our shield, but even shields do not last forever." Darren's grip tightened on his plasma cutter. "Then we'll just have to make sure ours never goes out. A plan for survival." Back at the fire, Darren sat down, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "All right, let's talk long term. We can't just sit here forever, fighting off shadows every night." Ruin sat across from him, his massive form at ease, but his mind clearly working. "No, we must move." Darren raised an eyebrow. "Move? Where?" Ruin gestured toward the distant mountains, now barely visible in the growing light. "There." Darren frowned. "That's a long way." Ruin nodded. "Yes, but there is shelter. Caves. Strong stone to protect us." Darren considered it. "That's good. But what about food? Fire?" Ruin reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a small glowing stone, another deep fire stone. Darren's eyes widened. "You had a second one this whole time." Ruin nodded. "One must always have fire." Darren let out a short laugh. "Well, that makes things easier." Ruin placed the stone near the flames. "Food will be harder. But we are hunters now." Darren smirked. "I guess we are." He glanced at the mountains again. The journey would be dangerous. The shadows might return. But staying here meant slow death, and Darren wasn't ready to die. "All right," he said, standing up. "Let's do it. Let's go find a real home." The journey begins. They packed quickly. Ruin carried most of the Shadow Maw's meat, while Darren secured the deep fire stone in a makeshift pouch. The fire at their campsite burned one last time, before they kicked snow over it and let the land reclaim the space. Darren looked back at the spot where they had fought, where they had survived. Then he turned forward. The mountains called them. The snow was deep, the air cold, but they moved with purpose. Darren felt lighter, despite the weight on his shoulders. He had food, he had fire, and for the first time since crashing on this planet, he had hope. Ruin walked beside him, his heavy steps steady. "This will be a hard journey, human." Darren grinned. "Yeah, well, I'm getting used to hard things." Ruin nodded. "Good. Then we will survive." Darren tightened his grip on his plasma cutter. The world around them was dangerous, unknown, but he wasn't alone. And as long as they kept the fire burning, As long as they stood against the dark, they would make it. One step at a time. The end.